Hello, everyone. My name is Kateryna Sivak. I'm a postgraduate researcher in Media and Cultural Studies at Birmingham Institute of Media and English. I would like to thank the organizing committee for this opportunity to be part of the Besides the Screen 2021 conference. The paper I'm presenting here is based on my ongoing ethnographic research into a diverse range of film distribution practices in Ukraine that exist beyond, or at least not entirely within, the official regulated spaces. In this talk, I will focus on two most common of such practices in Ukraine, namely unofficial online cinemas and amateur voiceover studios. It has a purposefully complex adjective in the title, and I will try to unpack this complexity and explain why the practices I will be talking about can be difficult to unequivocally define as traditional or non-traditional, formal or informal, mainstream or non-mainstream. At the theoretical core of my research project is the informal media economy framework introduced by Ramon Lobato and Julian Thomas in their book The Informal Media Economy in 2015. This framework essentially challenges the more established approach in the media studies, which views official, formal media industry institutions and routes of media circulation predetermined by them as the main, most important elements of the global media culture. Instead, Lobato and Thomas suggest that more informal media practices, which are often controversially termed piracy, are just as significant, widespread, and deserve far more attention than they have previously received. Or, as they put it, the most important aspect of informal media might not be its exotic, shadowy existence in a parallel world, but its presence, sometimes unnoticed, in the most mainstream parts of the media industries and in the most mundane, everyday media experiences. It is from this more inclusive perspective that I approach unofficial screen media practices in Ukraine. In this case, Ukraine might appear as a rather expected choice of the geographic context to explore informal film distribution. The country has been often regarded as the one with some of the highest levels of media piracy in the world. For example, Ukraine has been regularly featured in the so-called priority watch list, which identifies countries that, according to the Office of the United States Trade Representative, insufficiently protect intellectual property rights. In addition, studies from the field of the informal economy highlight that developing non-Western, especially post-Soviet countries such as Ukraine, just in general tend to have considerably more blurred lines between formality and informality. As Polovenchuk notes, it is indeed the case that Ukrainians consider such unofficial distribution practices as, for example, file sharing, perfectly acceptable, at the very least because these practices are often the only possible way to access desired films and TV shows in the country. In fact, what the findings from my research point towards is that unofficial ways of localizing and distributing screen media in Ukraine are more than simply present in the mainstream parts of the media industries. They can actually be viewed as the very constituents of what is seen as the traditional mainstream media economy of Ukraine. In other words, the question that I want to address here is whether such practices as unofficial online cinemas and amateur voiceover studios can be defined as traditional distribution in the context of Ukraine, despite the fact that they have rarely been even considered by the more established Western approaches within the media studies. Before I move on, a quick note on the methodology that I adopted for this research. I adhere to virtual ethnography, which means that the information about the practices in question that I provide here draws from walkthrough of these unofficial film distribution platforms and services, news and media articles, some of which contain interview transcripts with their founders, and non-participant observation of the forum of one of the major torrent trackers in Ukraine. It is also worth mentioning that although in Ukraine, online cinemas and especially voiceover studios that I'm looking at are well known to the general public, and people behind those services and platforms do not particularly hide their real names, it is important to recognize that they would unlikely be able to operate so openly in Western countries, where copyright enforcement is more strict. For that reason, Even though a lot of the information about them is openly available on the Ukrainian internet, for ethical considerations, I am not using any real names of the studios, cinemas, and people who operate them. The first of such widespread unofficial ways to distribute and accordingly access screen media content in Ukraine are so-called illegal online cinemas. These are essentially web platforms where one can find and stream a wide range of films and TV shows for free. These web platforms are relatively user-friendly in a sense that all the content is categorized, often by genre. Every film or TV show tends to have a poster and a detailed description of the story, as well as such details as the year of release, director's name, cast, etc. Think Popcorn Time, for example. The content one can stream on the platform originates from torrent trackers. Although these online cinemas do not charge their audience for watching films, they still manage to make profit, usually from advertising. In Ukraine, it is predominantly online casinos and online bookmakers and betting sites who become advertisers on such platforms. Now, if asked whether such online cinemas are legal, it is very likely that most would answer no, they're not. Indeed, the very fact that the content on these platforms is of pirate origin makes defining them as legal rather problematic. Furthermore, Ukrainian copyright legislation explicitly states that any film distribution is only legal when a distributor has an official state-granted certificate which formally allows to distribute and stream content, let alone that any distribution needs to be permitted by the copyright holders. It is largely on the basis of these laws that, for example, the Ukrainian cyber police closes down such cinemas, whilst a major anti-piracy initiative called Clear Sky publishes and constantly updates a list of such web platforms which Ukrainian media holdings and rights holders report as infringing copyright. Yet, there is a reason why I put the term illegal in quotes here. As it has always been the case, see for example never-ending legal pursuits of the Pirate Bay, it is not always easy to close down an official film distributor. As numerous scholars point out, loopholes in legislation allow such practices to quickly reappear and continue to operate. For instance, such web platforms in Ukraine tend to have a legal disclaimer for the rights holders wishing to report copyright infringing activity. A common message displayed on the online cinema's website makes mention of the fact that the purpose of the content made available on them is purely for people to familiarize themselves with a creative work rather than for distribution. In addition, echoing the Ukrainian copyright legislation, the disclaimer often notes that the web platform will happily remove any content that is believed to be copyright infringing, as long as those reporting it are able to provide official proof that they are indeed the true copyright holders. Yet, the most important here are not necessarily the legal disputes and uncertainties, which, as the history of prosecuting media pirates shows, can remain unresolved for ages, but the central role and place of these unofficial online cinemas in Ukraine. The recent work of Bonder and Martyuk, for example, confirms that the primary way most Ukrainians watch content is indeed online. However, as these quotes from major national and regional news sources in Ukraine indicate, availability of legal online cinemas in the country remains an issue. Put differently, the narrative in these news articles appears to be effectively based on the idea that unofficial, illegal sources of content are equally accepted by people with the legal ones. In fact, it could even be argued that it is the unofficial platforms that are seen as the norm, the benchmark, the traditional way of accessing films and TV shows. There is no single factor that such dominance of the unofficial ways of accessing, hence distributing content, could be exclusively attributed to. Previous research into the reasons behind piracy in various parts of the world, for example, the study by Joe Karaganis, Media Piracy in Emerging Economies, has highlighted inadequate pricing as well as issues with clarity of laws and regulations as some of the key factors. And this still, to a certain extent, remain relevant for Ukraine. Yet, one such factor, which is rather unique for Ukraine, is a serious lack of Ukrainian subtitles, dubbing, or voiceover of foreign films and TV shows. Indeed, the news articles mentioned here, when reviewing legal platforms available for Ukrainians such as Netflix, Amazon Prime, or Google Play, often warn that despite a wide range of films and TV shows offered by them, very few actually have subtitles in Ukrainian, and even fewer have dubbing or voiceover, which is a far more preferred option for Ukrainians. This gap is currently being fulfilled by so-called amateur voiceover studios. Although these services are being widely referred to as studios, not all of them actually have a physical sound recording studio. Some of the studios are simply groups of people, often professional actors or voice actors with relevant degrees. The studios are normally crowdfunded, meaning they suggest a film or a TV show that they're ready to translate and create voiceover for. And if people donate a sufficient sum of money, the studio then goes on to create a voiceover. Yet it is important to say, however, that the money people donate is needed purely to cover the minimal costs of either running a studio or for a professional translator, meaning these groups do not make any profit from these activities. Once the voiceover is created, it is then distributed via torrents, sometimes social media, or picked up by online cinemas. In other words, once uploaded to a torrent, the studio loses any control over the voiceover they'd created. As some of the founders of such studios mentioned in the interviews to regional and online news media outlets, the main motivation behind their non-profit voluntary practice is to help Ukrainians enjoy more films in their own language. As they explain, an official online space is saturated with content translated into Russian, which is the language that many Ukrainians happen to understand. Yet it is not the language that many Ukrainians would prefer if they had choice. Legal streaming services such as Netflix and Amazon, as the studio's founders explain, do not yet see the need to heavily invest in the Ukrainian translation, as the numbers of those who can at least understand Russian seem sufficient to continue as it is, so to speak. An illustrative case of this unmet demand can be this petition signed by over 100,000 people on change.org, aimed to encourage Netflix and Amazon to add Ukrainian dubbing and subtitles. After this petition, a couple of official Ukrainian dubbing studios have joined Netflix post-partner program, and it is said that Netflix is currently working on a Ukrainian version of its interface. However, whilst this certainly is a big step forward, the number of foreign films and shows available in Ukrainian language officially remains low. Furthermore, it is interesting to note that even some of the official Ukrainian online cinemas have been sometimes caught for using the voiceover from these amateur voiceover studios, which only confirms a certain reluctance to invest in official translation and dubbing in Ukraine. So, what can be concluded from such nature and arguably central place of these unofficial film distribution and localization practices in Ukraine? I suggest that the geographic context plays a vital role in how one should approach exploring a specific media economy. It is possible that in a non-Western, smaller, relatively understudied media economy, the notions of traditional or mainstream may refer to diametrically opposite types of film distribution practices that in the media economies of the more developed countries. In many countries around the globe, Netflix, for example, has long become a mainstream, widely used platform to watch screen media content. Yet, despite being available in Ukraine since 2016, the lack of Ukrainian dubbed films and TV shows continues to place it far behind the more localized, though unofficial platforms. I should, however, clarify that by understudied in this context, I do not mean that there aren't enough studies into the non-Western media economies. In this regard, I rather support the perspective of Chariot and Ferrer-Connell, who argue that the issue today is indeed not so much with the number of works exploring non-Western contexts, but with the extent to which the findings from these non-Western countries are incorporated in theory development. Simply put, Whilst there is an increasing number of works looking beyond the developed country's context, the perspectives they discover generally retain the status of alternative, whereas Western approaches not only remain central, but, as they put it, are pigeonholed to the core. What this therefore suggests is that formal institutionalized approach to film distribution should only be seen as traditional in some specific contexts, because as examples with online cinemas and voiceover studios hopefully highlighted, the traditional mainstream range of films distribution practices in Ukraine is rather different. Thank you for your attention.